Yo, don't get it twisted. This war on masculinity, war on patriarchy is not what it seems. If you take Me Too, for example, every high profile Me Too case you've seen where a person in a position of authority has been outed and called all kinds of things, who do they really replace them with after that? Right? This is what it's fundamentally about. This is essentially a socio-political coup. And these kinds of terms and practices are used to replace high profile men with women. Doubt me? When's the last time you seen a Me Too case in the news over somebody who packed groceries at the grocery store? Don't get it twisted. This ain't what it's supposed to be. Like, share, subscribe, join, and donate if you will. Support the channel so we can continue to bring you independent Black male thought, unfiltered by corporate interest or unfiltered by political correctness. We're getting to the point of what information Black men need to have access to. Now, this piece is by Andrew Tate. I'm not necessarily familiar with all his work. And I have to say this, every time I back what somebody said, then the question always comes up, well, he said something 5 years ago that was horrible. Look, I take people not only on a case-by-case basis, but I'm more interested in what they're saying in the given moment that I'm referencing them. So I know nothing about Andrew Tate as a person or in terms of his work, but I agree with what he said in this clip. And I think it's important, right? But he's saying this in general, most particularly as it pertains to white men. And essentially what he's arguing is that not all white men are patriarchs, right? And this is a position you can take back to the beginning. I mean, at the end of the day, they're not, right? They operate in a system where most of them have very little. Most of what America moves on is the promise of elitism, the promise that one day you too can be an oligarch. You too can be in a position to exploit others, to benefit from others, to, make money without having to do anything, that kind of thing. But the majority of men, majority of men have barely a pot to piss in, really, especially in regard to how they're perceived. Now, here's the thing. We here at the Onyx Report focus on Black men and boys. And in this whole question about patriarchy, where do we fit Black men? Because much like white men, Black men have been maligned with this idea of the Black patriarchy and how oppressive it's been. But when you start pushing back and asking questions about where this oppression comes from and what it looks like, then you start getting anecdotal stories. I've said this for the longest. When you ask even Black feminists about white patriarchy, they can give you a laundry list of examples of what that white patriarchy looks like in terms of property ownership, electoral representation, status, high-level positions in the corporate world, policy influencers and creators, so on and so forth. You get all of that. When you ask about Black male patriarchy, you get individual stories about grandmothers who were abused by their husbands. You get anecdotal stories about the big piece of chicken. And the reason they resort to these kind of bullshit references is because they don't have any structural ones. They don't. Much of the time when you saw periods in African-American history where you had a strong emphasis on the nuclear family, a strong emphasis on males in positions of authority, this was often authorized and backed by women, because the Black community wanted to demonstrate that they too could participate. So whether you're talking about Reconstruction, whether you're talking about the rise of the Black church or Black church culture, that family framework of male first, rooted in Bible at that, was often framed in that manner on purpose, even politically. Notice Black politics extended out of the Black church. It wasn't because men were better and stronger. That's not what it was. In the African-American community, it was a desire to see men, often by women, in positions of authority, in positions of leadership, to debunk and contradict the stereotypes about the Black community. One of the major ones being that we were backward in terms of our gender dynamic, right? What white society presented was that they were the norm. Males were in positions of authority, women followed. The Black community was presented as the exact opposite. So in response to that, Black folk actually wanted to demonstrate in many instances that Black men could lead and be intelligent and so on and so forth. This all begins to get debunked in the late 60s and 70s when feminism, in and of itself, coming out of white women's political attempts to have their own coup, right, sought out women of color to back them in their endeavors. And this had a multiple benefit to them, right? It got them foot soldiers to advance their agenda, but it also destabilized the political movements that were challenging the country, especially during the Cold War, right? So the civil rights movement at one point that saw the greatest potential to actually link together various demographics within the Black community that may not have linked together prior, especially to that degree, saw itself undone, starting first with feminism, right? Asking Black women to measure their womanhood versus their racial, orientation. And that's where we get to with this. So when Tate raises this whole question about white men, the majority of whom are not in a position to be, toxic, exploitive patriarchs, he's right. But the issue going beyond that for Black men is that not only are we not patriarchs, there isn't a legacy of Black male patriarchy that has not been ordained and supported by Black women. And one of the ways we can measure this is to actually look at the institutions that leave that in place. So if you look at white society and you look at patriarchy, you have institutions that replicate that, from the family to the workplace, to the congressional and political, not even just congressional, to governmental structure. What structures in the Black community maintain patriarchy? What structures in the Black community do Black men control that leverage power and resources over women to forcibly coerce them to participate in a patriarchy that works against their interests? What institutions are we pointing to? The only institutions we can really point to that leverage influence on the Black family, especially when you start talking about government, but even if you talk about cultural institutions like churches, like the family itself, those institutions lean toward women. Women are in positions of authority, not men, even over the family. This is something Robert Staples pointed out in like 1977. Even then, he was saying Black men aren't even present in the family like that to be in a position of authority. The church, it's a symbolic figurehead. The majority of the church is women. Most pastors operate by deferment. They defer to the women in their audience. Occasionally, you may hear one drop a critique of women in his sermon, but he ain't gonna do that much if he wants to keep his church. And the larger the churches got, the more mega churches we got, the more women filled the pews, the more they catered to women. So when we talk about white men, Tate is saying that, not all white men are patriarchs. When you talk about Black men, there is no Black male patriarchy, especially one that hasn't been ordained by women. And this is a critical point we got to get across, because not only is there a difference between white men and Black men, there's a difference between white male history and Black male history. Our relationship to the very idea of manhood is different. We were deemed we weren't even considered human, let alone men. That's something Black men had to fight for. This is one of the reasons you see a somewhat shift in the perception of Black men when you start to get to everything from the Civil War, World War I, World War II, all the way up through sports and activism. Black men had to fight for a change in how they were perceived. This is not a norm by any measure, right? The other thing we have to take into account is that the way patriarchy is being framed, especially by many feminists today, or women who lean feminist, even if they've never read a feminist text, right, is they want to cherry pick patriarchy's offerings while denouncing the whole thing. It's ultimately it's really a straw man argument, right? Where they fabricate this superficial notion of patriarchy and then dismantle it, so-called, in front of you to dismiss the idea. But at the end of the day, they cherry pick it based on what they want, right? So they like elements of patriarchy. They like protection. They like provisioning, right? They like being foregrounded. They like being considered the exalted princess on a pedestal, having womanhood pedestalized. This is something we first see with white women. They enjoy that. They like that element of patriarchy, and they want those things to continue. They want deferment to women as a priority, whether we're talking about, the draft, whether we're talking about resources like welfare and whatnot being, or family court being female, bending, tending toward females' interests. They like those things, and nobody wants to get rid of it. You're not seeing a large swath of feminists arguing that women should be drafted into war. especially after the Ukraine. Once they saw that shit, they realized this shit is real and women don't want it. So they want to keep those elements of it while ignoring the drudgery of patriarchy, right? They want patriarchal authority as white men have, but they also want the patriarchal benefits that white women receive. But nobody wants to be a janitor. No, none of those feminists want to be in a coal mine. You don't see it. At the end of the day, we have to be clear about this cherry picking and what's being done with it. And we have to call it out for what it is, because it's ultimately an exploitive gesture, but it's also a political coup that's designed to put women in positions of authority while hopefully absolving them from actually having to do the grunt work that goes along with the idea and the practice of patriarchy as we've seen it. But when you attribute this to black men aren't in a position to benefit or exploit anybody in the name of it at all. If there's so much emphasis placed on black men being these monsters, it benefits women and LGBT groups to demonize and criminalize black men, heterosexual black men, as the cause of the problem. And their careers advance, especially in the academy, the more they do it. We have to be mindful, we have to call it out, and we got to reference the material and the arguments and the data that proves the point. All right, fellas. Peace.